to Johnny. So please tell us a little bit more about yourself, about the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits, and take us into your topic. I am happy to help facilitate any Q&A from the chat thread, or if we remain a small group, if you have a question and want to unmute yourself, that would be fine too. So thank you, Johnny.
Thank you, Wendy. I appreciate you having me again. As Wendy said, I apologize everybody's having to look at me tonight instead of Kim Leverage, who's our Director of Learning and Professional Development, but circumstances being what they are. And I do want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us. I know tomorrow is the end of this historic 394-year campaign that's been going on. We're in the middle of 2020, of ice storm in Oklahoma City. A lot of things have happened, but you all are still taking an hour out tonight so we can learn how to be better board members and effective people, and I appreciate that. As Wendy said, my name is Johnny Buschardt. I'm the Senior Manager of Training and Consulting with the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits. I've been with them since 2018 here in the Tulsa office at Legacy Plaza. Prior to that, I spent about 3 years in the nonprofit sector here, serving as in both Director of Development and Executive Director roles here in Tulsa. And prior to that, I spent about 20 years in the entertainment industry. You can see the posters behind me, running the Brady Theater for several years and the Mabee Center, and then kind of working on some other projects in the concert field. A lot of folks were asking me when I first started, what is the how do you relate concert business to nonprofit business? And I said, well, both of us start off with $0 in the bank and hope to have some at the end. And both involves managing egos on the artist side and egos sometimes on the board side. So today what we're going to be talking about is how you can be a great board member. I'm going to start, of course, by sharing my screen. And the reason that we included this specific title in our tonight's presentation, how you can be a great board member and committee member, is because great board members are usually great committee members, and committees do the work of the board. And at some point in your board service, you'll be asked to serve on a committee. And if so, we hope you find a great one. The purpose of tonight's presentation is to kind of help you build your confidence level and help you understand what is going to be required of you as a board member, and not just what is required legally, because we're going to touch on that briefly, but how you can bring everything that makes up who you are to the board service area so you can become a better board member and help your organization as we move further. As Wendy said, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. She's going to be watching the chat, although feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand and wave it in the screen. I'd love to answer any questions we may have. Normally, this presentation is about a 5-hour class that we teach. We're going to be touching on the highlights and condensed it down to an hour. So we won't be able to take deep dives, but we will be able to cover a lot of topics here in the next hour. So the basic agenda for tonight, we're going to be talking about your skill sets as a board member, and your skill sets are yours and yours alone. No one else can be you, can have your perception, can speak or think or do the way you are, can do you the way that you can. So please keep in mind the very first thing I'm going to plant as a slide in the next in the next slide presentation is going to be what I call a thought slide. And the number one thing I'm going to be asking you to think about throughout our entire presentation is your own skill set. What do you bring that someone else doesn't? Because that's crucial to board service. I will talk about why folks join a board. A board is a team. A lot of folks don't understand the difference between an individual team and a team of individuals. We're going to speak about that. Then the legal duties, that's what you're going to be required to be as a board member. Of course, how you can be effective, and then how you can make your decisions as a board member moving forward, because that's really what the sole purpose of a board member is to help guide things. So that thought prompt slide I was talking about earlier, for the remainder of our presentation, and we're going to come in probably right around 50 minutes to an hour. I'd like to have time for a few questions at the end. I want you to be asking yourselves, first and foremost, what skill set do you bring? And your skill set is not just a certification you may have received or an formal education that you may have received. It's your perspective, how you do things, what you bring to a table that someone else may not be able to. Now, in some cases, those skill set Venn diagrams may overlap, but I have never, in the thousands of nonprofits that I work with, and I'm sure Wendy will say in the thousands of leadership Tulsa graduates you've had, never seen those Venn diagrams overlap 100% and not have any room for side gauging is what we call it. So keep in mind you're asking yourself what your skill set is. Number two, why do you want to be a board member? We're going to talk about why people become board members here on the next slide, but you need to ask yourself in a true and honest way, why am I becoming a board member? Is it because I feel I'm bringing this unique skill set and this great perspective to an organization? Or are there some ulterior motives that are sometime at play? Both of them factor into the human psyche. It's going to happen. And there's nothing wrong with ulterior motives. You just want to make sure that we have an understanding of why we're doing the board service that we're doing before we start. And then lastly, I ask people, why do we want to do anything with this particular group? Is it that we want to fill a seat and warm it up for 90 minutes once a month? Or do we want to see an organization moving forward in a way that we can know will make a greater impact on the community? So as we move forward through the slides, we'll probably spend 3 or 4 minutes on each slide, but ask yourself, what skill set am I bringing? Why would I want to join a board service? And why would we want to have anything to do with this organization and help move it forward? Hopefully 2 or 3 of those overlap, as we were talking about earlier, but they're questions I want you to keep in mind as we move forward. So first and foremost, why do people join boards? Contrary to popular belief, most people do not join a board because they have a passion to the cause. Statistically speaking, most people join a board because it looks good on their resume. A very, very close second is because someone near and dear to them asked. And third in line is that they have a passion for the cause or they believe in what they're doing. But as you can see from the slide in front of you, there are a lot of different reasons we may join a board. First and foremost, the altruistic aspect. Hey, we have a selfless concern for the public good. We understand it's a real need and we want to move forward in that addressing that need. Number 2, that community status and public visibility or recognition. Sometimes when I ask people, hey, did you join this board because of the status it brings? They assume that that implies some type of vanity on their part. It doesn't. People who get things done understand well-connected, powerful people can get more things done. They can have a greater impact if they have a higher profile to spread their message, and that's their motivating factor. So sometimes asking for that public visibility or that recognition, it's not a vanity project for you. It's just that you understand, hey, the more people I have listening to what I say, the more people I have who are going to hear my message. Sometimes there are those altruistic business interests. I have more than one person that I work with who's joined the board because they believed in some other people there and they wanted to help support them, which was completely understandable. That prestige, that affiliation that I think we put professionally, socially, educationally, whatever it may be, sometimes just having that association, we want to be associated with that because it does help us professionally, helps us expand our network, helps people hear why we're doing what we do, sometimes helps us even expand the services that we offer through those connections. A big one, as I mentioned, number 2, pressure from others and a reluctance to say no. I tell people I wish we could all take the same approach that Girl Scouts do. The reason Girl Scouts are so successful is they'll stand and ask a random group of strangers if they want to buy cookies, and when someone says no, it doesn't hang them up one way or the other. They'll just ask the next person. But as we acclimate to society and we become human beings, we have an inherent fear of rejection. And when someone says, Wendy, I think you'd be great on our board, would you be interested in helping out? We immediately want to say, yes, we do. And then the next thing we know, we're on the end of a 3-year term just because we had a good relationship with someone else and weren't comfortable speaking up. To get in there and get things done, this can be both a blessing and a curse. We're actually going to talk about this on the next slide. A lot of people join a board because they say something needed to be done. I had to be the one to do it. It's easier for me to go in and do things than to wait for something else to happen. I couldn't sit by any longer and not get something done. That's a wonderful approach to long-term service, but most of the time that's actually a short-term approach. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. And then again, there are, unfortunately, it's third most of the time, a desire for a meaning in somebody's life, a desire to learn, a desire to give to the common good, which ties back into that altruism. But when most people join a board, again, statistically speaking, it's because it's going to enhance their resume, it's going to enhance their public image, it will be great for networking. I know many news affiliate folks who join boards because they like hunting down stories easier through some of their connections that way. So realize we all join boards for a wide variety of reasons, and they're all right. None of these reasons are wrong because at the end of the day, you're furthering the mission, you're enhancing the impact, and you're bettering the community through your service. So keep in mind, just because you may have a bit of a personal motivation doesn't mean that you're not fully devoted to the cause. But you'll need to know what your motivation is as you move forward.
So Johnny, I often say that joining a board is a huge honor for about 5 minutes, and then it's a lot of work.
Exactly right. I tell people all the time, I say, because in my role, I train people and I consult people. I don't have to serve as executive director and I don't have to serve on boards anymore. And it is a wonderful honor. I tell people for about 24 hours, I give about 23 hours and 55 more minutes. But after that, it becomes a lot of work. And if you're lucky, the work pays off. If you're not, sometimes you'll feel like you're spinning your wheels. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Thank you, Wendy. It's nice to know I'm not the only one who feels that way. So as I mentioned earlier, a board is a team. And I always use the expression, it's an individual team, not a team of individuals. And while we think we have a basic understanding of what a team is, the fact is a team can be broken down into a couple different areas. And I wanted to share those with everybody. First and foremost is that working group, project-based or task-oriented. They want to come in and get it done. But because they want to get it done, they might not have defined what it is. And that come in and get it done mentality means I come in, I tackle a project, but I didn't necessarily realize that project was only 1 degree of a full circle and not the entire end game of what we're trying to do. So keeping in mind, while a working group is beneficial in a lot of areas, it's not necessarily a healthy, high-functioning team. There's also the pseudo team. Those are the folks who share information. They keep each other up to date, and they tend to send a lot of emails back and forth, but nothing ever actually gets done. We all know these groups. There's a lot of information sharing going on, but not a lot of action. I tell people sometimes that's when enthusiasm outweighs experience. We're chatting back and forth. We're talking about the good that needs to be done, but we're not actually doing anything about it. Most commonly in the nonprofit sector, especially in about the last 10 or 15 years, you see this come to play in terms of diversity and equity and inclusion. We all want to talk about how important it is, but most organizations aren't taking steps to actually achieve that goal. Luckily, and I'm not just bragging because we're a Tulsa-based group, here in Northeast Oklahoma, we're doing a very good job of addressing these, both within our own organizations, community partners built across the entire region and across the state, and we're seeing that. But a lot of times, you'll see folks that are acting as pseudo teams or working groups, but not actually teams. Now, then you do have a team, and you say, hey, we're sharing these goals, we're sharing the effort moving towards it. It's not what I call the high school group project, where we all knew one person who was going to do most of the work and 2 or 3 people would slide in and sign their names the day of. Everybody's concerned. They're putting in equal time and effort. They're all bringing that respective skill set we talked about earlier towards a common goal, which is usually a public need that has been given 501c designation through the IRS. However, what separates a team from a high-functioning team is, as you can tell at the bottom, a high-functioning team is not only invested in that common good, but they're invested in the development of the other individuals and themselves as a team as we move forward. I always tell people when we give our boot camp for boards, which is a day-long curriculum based on folks who need to know how to do proper board service, but have never even been exposed to a board before. We tell them how to do it, how to build, how to plan for the future, etc. And I tell people, one of the pro tips that I offer in that is I can tell if an organization is very forward thinking and a strong organization by looking at their budget. Because about 85% of the time, a good organization has money set aside for staff development. But 98% of the time, a great organization has money set aside for board development as well. They have that approach. If we're any good at all, we know we can be better. We're always trying to learn. We're always trying to become more knowledgeable. We're always trying to become better balanced in our funding portfolio. They're always trying to invest in themselves as well as the common good. And that's what we're trying to do today, is to give you some aspects of a high-functioning team so we know what to look for when you move forward in your board service. So keeping in mind that as a board operates as one, a board has things that fall into 2 categories. Number 1 is what we call the main jobs, and number 2 is the legal duties. So the 3 main jobs of an organization. Number 1 is to establish that organizational identity. I tell people an organization is a lot like the head of a snake. I used to say that, and then I realized it probably wasn't the best analogy. As goes the head, so goes the rest of the snake. And a successful forward-thinking board is going to result in successful forward-thinking organizations. A board that's bickering and is a team of individuals instead of an individual team is going to result in an organization that's the same. So the first thing a board does is help an organization actually come up with its own organizational identity. Number 2 purpose, or the main job of a board, is to ensure those resources so that every aspect of the organization has everything they need to be successful. The best analogy for this, and we can use this because it became a thing in the Winter Olympics, probably 4 or 5 Olympics ago, is the concept of curling. If you've seen that, it looks like they take a hockey puck and somebody with a broom goes and sweeps in front of them. And the sole purpose of the person with the sweeper, they're called, is to clear any obstacle out of the way, to allow that forward motion to go on as unimpeded for as long as possible. That's what a board does. We remove all those obstacles, and part of that is providing all the resources you need financially, in terms of HR, in terms of marketing, public image, awareness, knowledge, all of it, so that the organization can be as successful as it can be. And then lastly, of course, we do have to provide oversight. As a board member, you will have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that the organization is running properly, not just financially, but in terms of best practices, in terms of policies and procedures, the processes it uses, et cetera. So the 3 main jobs of a board, and when someone says, hey, would you like to be on our board? I want everyone to keep this in mind, to help establish that organizational identity, ensure all the resources are in place for success, and then to help make sure that everything stays as it should be, which is a series of evaluation and knowledge education on the part of the board member. Those are the main jobs. Now, as a board member, you actually have legal obligations. Some folks don't understand. Board members are legally responsible for nonprofit organizations. In fact, when the PPP funding came available, all the COVID-19 relief funding came available for the first time, in no small part due to Senator Langford's efforts on Oklahoma's behalf, nonprofits were allowed to accept this SBA funding. And it was such a phenomenal, or such a unique perspective, that the government asked for nonprofits to report who their owner was. And as we know, nonprofits don't have owners. Nobody owns a nonprofit. They're created by the public good for the public good. However, we do have responsibilities that the IRS dictates that I need to let everyone know about, because I am shocked how many board members are not aware of these duties that they have. The first duty is fairly simple in concept. It's called duty of care. That means you need to make decisions that are in the best interest of the organization at all times. Now, the legal threshold for that is that you must make the same decision an ordinarily or reasonably prudent person would in the same or similar circumstances. Simply put, if you have $1,000 in the bank and you have no capital campaign or no funding plan in place to raise $1 million, would you commit to spending $1 million on a new building? No, most of us wouldn't. That's not something an ordinarily reasonably prudent person would do. So as a board member, you have to act in the organization's best interest at all times. And that can be difficult, but it's a decision you have to make. Number 2 is called the duty of loyalty. Simply put, you have to stay loyal to those interests at all times, even if those best interests of the organization aren't in alignment with your own opinion. The simplest way to define the duty of loyalty is that if you're on a 15-person board and the vote is 8-7, the duty of the 7 is to honor the vote of the 8. They must move forward knowing that the group as a whole decided as one body to move forward in this direction, and they must support that. A smaller way that it doesn't often come into play, and when it does, it's not always positive, is the concept of a conflict of interest. As a board member, you have to set aside any personal interest or any personal benefit and only make decisions in the best interest of the organization. So where this comes into play, and we won't have a deep dive on conflict of interest, but I'll give an example, because I can see Michelle and Mercedes' name at the top of my screen. I'll use them as an example. Mercedes works for a nonprofit that has a big event every year, and they spend $15 on t-shirts, $15 per shirt, to promote this event. Well, Michelle's joined the board. She owns a t-shirt shop, and she could sell these t-shirts to the organization for $12 a pop. That means $3 per shirt could be reduced in price, more money for the mission, but it also means Michelle would be receiving a benefit from the business conducted. Now, what if Michelle agrees to only sell the t-shirts at cost? She's still receiving bulk discount, purchase discounts. She's still getting an increased enhancement in the community for her business. Those benefits are still in place. So in that situation, this is how you handle a conflict and maintain your duty of loyalty. Michelle has to say, I'm a conflicted party in this situation. I must recuse myself from the boardroom for the discussion and the decision involving this situation. Michelle has to physically leave the room. get far enough away where she can't hear the conversation in real time. That's the threshold. Then the board, without Michelle's involvement, has a discussion, makes a decision, and then Michelle's allowed to come back in the room. When that happens, when the conflict has been disclosed, conflicted parties are recused, they don't come back in until after discussion and decision, then there's not a conflict because she wasn't involved and couldn't influence the decision. When people don't disclose a conflict, it seems to come in that there is a conflict at play or even a perceived conflict. Folks start having issues, and then it becomes usually a PR nightmare. So understand, not only do you have to make decisions in the best interest of the organization, you have to stay loyal to those decisions, even if you are on the losing side of the vote and you can't act in your own best interest at the same time. Those are the big two things. Number three is fairly simple, duty of obedience. That means as a board member, you have to obey all federal, state, municipal laws and your own bylaws of your organization. Now, I promise you, no one is going to know your organization's bylaws better than either a disgruntled ex-employee or a disgruntled ex-board member. Those two folks tend to be experts on your bylaws. But if you're aware of your bylaws and you're actually following them, you have nothing to worry about. The biggest bylaw violation is probably term limits. I'll say, hey, we have 2 3-year terms here at the Oklahoma Center for Nonprofit. Wendy has been on our board for 14 years. Well, there's a violation of our bylaws right there. Now, in an absolute worst case scenario, actions that occurred from the date of the bylaw infraction forward could potentially be negated. That doesn't really happen very often, but you need to make sure as a board member, I'm doing the best interest of the organization. I'm not having any conflicts and I'm moving forward loyal to those interests. We're maintaining obedience to all state, federal, municipal laws, our own organizational bylaws. And then lastly is the duty of transparency. That means you have to operate in the light, openly and freely, with all the decisions that you make. The simplest way this comes into play is that all nonprofit organizations are required to provide their 990 to anyone who asks for it. If anyone were to come in and say, hey, Michelle, can I get a copy of that 990? You have to provide that to them. It can be a hard copy. It can be a digital copy. It can be provisioned by having it on your website that they can go and download. But everyone is entitled, through the Pension Protection Act of 2008, everyone is entitled to a 990 of a nonprofit organization anytime they request it. And you're legally required to file a 990. If you're small enough, it could just be the postcard that you get, but you're legally required to file your 990 each year. If you do not file a 990 for 3 years in a row, your 501c status will be revoked. Although I have heard of the IRS revoking status after people don't file it for 1 year until they do get it filed, and it's usually reinstated. But understand, as board members, when someone says, hey, will you serve on our board? They're saying, will you come and help us with our cause? But you need to understand, yes, I will. I just want to make sure that we understand I'm acting in the best interest of the organization. I have no personal benefits or conflicts. We're going to be in obedience with all laws, and we're going to operate in the light. Most of the time, this isn't an issue. 94, 95% of the time, none of these things are violated and they never become an issue. However, if one of them does, it can become a total disaster and a total fiasco. So we ask everybody, in fact, when I've been asked to join boards as a consultant, I get asked probably 3 or 4 times a year. I have 3 questions. Number 1, how often do you meet and how long do they last? If you meet quarterly and we meet for 2 hours, there's a much better chance I can make that time commitment than if we meet every other week for 4 hours at a pop. Number 2, I'm going to ask if you have D&O insurance. Do you have an insurance policy in place to protect directors and officers while I'm acting as a board member in the organization's best interest? Should one of those PR nightmares happen, the first person that Anderson Cooper, or the Attorney General for that matter, is going to call is the board members. Am I going to be protected? And then lastly, I said, can you explain to me what the 3 requirements of the IRS are in terms of duties and what the duty of transparency requirement is? If someone can tell me what those 4 are and answer those questions, then my interest in joining your board just went up about 85%. But if not, then I usually don't have much interest because it tells me that you haven't taken yourself as seriously as you should be. Before we move on, does anybody have any questions over the legal duties or anything else that we've talked about? Or Wendy, do you have any thoughts to add on these?
No, so I can recall, actually, Carlos, Living Arts got board insurance the first year that I joined the board because I asked about it. So that is a good plan. So I also teach these duties, and I think they're very important.
Yes, I will tell you, my first day on the job, Marnie told me, she said, Marnie Taylor is our president and CEO. She said, Johnny, as a consultant, you're going to find out 99.9% of the time when we get called in, it goes back to a governance issue. And I thought, that seems like a very broad statement, but Marnie's been here 8 years at the time. She would know. I will tell you, over my almost 3 years now, every time I get called in, it goes back to a governance issue, usually one of these legal duties that you have to do. So keep in mind those are required. Now, while you're doing all of that, keeping in mind, hey, this is why I'm joining this board. Sometimes there may be some professional benefits, but I also believe in the cause. I'm making sure we're sticking in legal compliance with all the things we're required to do. You're going to be wearing 3 hats. And I specifically chose this picture because it's cute kitty cats. And I know it's 2020, like engaging is hard enough as it is. So I threw that picture up there. First and foremost, that governance hat that you're wearing only occurs when board meetings are occurring from opening to adjournment or from call to order to adjournment and at no other time. That's when you're wearing governance hat. During board meetings, you're making legally binding decisions to move the organization forward underneath all of the different factors we talked about earlier. And that's when you're going to be having that governance hat on. My fiance happens to work for a nonprofit as well. And when I get home at night, if she has a question, I will ask her, are you asking do you need the fiance answer or do you want the consultant answer? If she says, I need the consultant answer, I'll take off the fiance hat and I'll put on the consultant hat and I'll say, this is why this is an awful idea. Let me explain it. But if she says, I just want the fiance answer, I'll say, well, that sounds like a pretty interesting idea. Maybe we could talk about that further. But she understands when that happens, then I'm coming in a professional capacity. In the same sense, when the board meetings are called to order, you're acting in a governance mode. You're making legally binding decisions that are going to have long-term impacts. And that's the role you're playing, so to speak, as a board member. Number 2 is that implementation. Now, this is where you're not necessarily in a board meeting. Board meetings haven't been called to order. You're not voting on things, but you are acting on behalf of the board. This may be making a phone call. This may be serving on a committee. This may be, hey, we need to launch a new diversity initiative. We're giving Wendy the authority to reach out to other people in the Tulsa community and represent us to build some strategic partnerships. So you're still a board member, but you're not necessarily voting on governance issues. This kind of stands out because this is in different situations, when applicable, you can be paid as a board member. You cannot be paid for your board service. That's forbidden. That's illegal for you to accept money for board service. But if you're doing things on behalf of the organization, as anyone else could be hired to do, you can be paid for this. The most easy to understand example is many arts communities will have board of directors who also serve as the director of the play or the producer of the play. They would hire a director anyway. So if a director's stipend is $250, that board member can't. That's all right, no worries. No, thank you. I'll get it when I'm done. Thank you, sir. That board member can accept a $250 stipend as director of the play, but not as board member for board service. So when you're in implementation or when you're in activity mode, that's the only time that occurs. And even then, that's probably the underwhelming minority. Only about 8 to 10% of boards ever have a time where they're going to actually pay their board members. Lastly is volunteer. And this seems to come as a bit of it seems like a juxtaposition because board members are volunteers. We can't receive any compensation for a board service. Volunteers is when you're actually volunteering for the organization in a non-governing role. This could be showing up to help set up for an event, driving a bus to pick up the kids for the after-school program, showing up to help pack a backpack, whatever it may be. You are setting off your governance role and you're only having your volunteer role on. The toughest thing that most board members have trouble accepting, when you're acting as a volunteer, you actually answer to the volunteer coordinator or the event planner or the CEO in some cases, and you're not a governing board member. You have to leave that hat on the board table. You can't pick it back up till the meeting's called to order. And sometimes we, as consultants, get called in for the technical term is communication issues. I call it couples counseling because some board members have issues saying, hey, I'm in charge and have to make big time decisions here. but here I need to let someone else make the decisions and I'm going to follow their lead. So understand when you're serving as a board member, when those meetings are called to order and you're voting on things and making these legally binding decisions, you're in governance mode. When
So
you volunteer,
Johnny,
yes,
I
Wendy.
put in the chat that I also think of these as like strategic, tactical, and operational levels of the organization. So
Exactly
the
right.
board has this high-level strategic role, determining the mission and programs, the budget, setting the policy, setting the strategic plan, the governance piece you're talking about. And then we have committees formed, and they're tactical, like we want to do this thing. How are we going to do this thing? And oftentimes at that tactical level, they're peer-to-peer with staff of the nonprofit. They're working hand in hand together to move it forward. And then I use that word operational, where you've used volunteer, which is I show up to help and I'm actually reporting to the staff of the nonprofit.
Exactly right. And you'll hear some people say we kind of have a 3-tier STO platform. That's exactly what they're talking about. Strategic, tactical, and operational. And Wendy set that up better. I'm going to take credit for the cuter picture in the analogy, but that's exactly, it's two sides of the same coin.
It is the cutest picture. I do like it.
Thank you. Trying to keep folks engaged. So very briefly, and because we're already more than halfway through our time, I don't want to necessarily open it up for a big discussion yet. But what I do want everyone to consider, many people say the biggest participation points in board service is just showing up. And whenever folks say that, I stop and I say, wait a second, are you asking folks to show up or to show up actually prepared? And there's a big difference. Showing up, anyone on this call, anyone I look out the window, the nice gentleman who just interrupted because he came to help clean our office up at the end of the day, anyone can show up. There's absolutely no challenge to that whatsoever. Showing up prepared, however, is a different situation. And as a board member, you have a responsibility to show up prepared. That means if materials are sent out in advance, you have to actually read them. If you have an agenda that you don't understand, you need to feel comfortable asking questions. In fact, a good guideline, always have 2 or 3 questions you're coming into a board meeting with, just to show that you need to make sure all perspectives are being covered. Showing up, people say the biggest part of board service is just showing up. No, that's the easy part of board service. Showing up prepared is the crucial part of board service that truly will make a difference in an organization and an organization's long-term sustainability. So I tell people, it's kind of like clothes. You can have clothes that are worn, and then you have clothes that are worn out. And you may have something that's used or versus something that's used up. Showing up is the easy part, but showing up prepared, that qualifying word I added at the end, is truly what's going to make a difference. And as a board member, the biggest aspect, we're going to talk about this shortly, the people ask me, when I taught Type Rose, this question came up. When I taught with Regent Bank, this question came up. If you could sum up the best trait, a single trait a great board member has, what would it be? I always say great board members ask questions. They want to know, hey, Courtney, I know we normally spend $600 a month on marketing. I see we're spending $4,000 this month. Can you explain why? Well, sure, we bought our marketing a year in advance to save money, and that's the expenditure we're putting. Thank you, that makes perfect sense. But what happens more often than not when we're called in, specifically for cases of fiscal malfeasance or nonfeasance where something shady has gone on, and I do one-on-one interviews with board members, more often than not, board members say, something didn't seem right, but I didn't feel comfortable speaking up. And I said, man, that's a whole separate cultural conversation, but you need to feel comfortable speaking up. And I've said this to typos, I've said this to Wendy directly. I love Leadership Tulsa. I love board intern programs because board interns who are just joining a board for the first time are always asking questions. And sometimes an experienced board won't have thought, wait a second, that is a great question. Why aren't we considering this? So all of the things we're talking about, the key component is that you're feeling comfortable asking questions. And the best way to do that, research the material, perform your due diligence, jot down a couple notes. There's nothing wrong with walking in with notes to a board meeting, and feel comfortable speaking up and asking those questions. I tell people, if you want to make a long-term difference in your organization's sustainability, or you want to maximize your impact, you want to better fulfill a mission, the simplest way to do that is to claim your voice. As I mentioned earlier, no one can be you as good as you can be. There's no better you than you. Shel Silverstein said it. Country songs have been written about it. There's no better you than you. And that means you're going to have a perspective that is truly unique. Of the 7 point whatever billion people on the planet, you're going to have a perspective that is yours and yours alone. And that perspective is going to bring great insight. As I mentioned, I think I mentioned earlier, I've taught a couple of these classes, so if I apologize if I haven't. Statistically speaking, pretty much every study since the early 80s has shown boards with higher levels of diversity, organizations with higher levels of diversity in their composition are more successful. That's because there's more perspectives and more information being brought to the table. You're the only person who has your voice. Feel free to exercise it. I know sometimes we tend to sell ourselves short on our expertise. We all have imposter syndrome. I don't want to speak up. It's my first day on the board. I don't want to be known as that person. I don't want to come off as not being knowledgeable. Believe me, asking questions is never a bad idea. Now, I tell people, talking about things, asking questions, never a bad idea. Talking about things and asking questions right at this specific moment sometimes may not be the best approach. But in board service, there's never anything wrong with asking a question. And if you don't feel comfortable speaking up, don't hesitate when you get your board materials to reach out to the board chair and say, hey, I noticed budget was in our consent agenda for a quick approval vote. I have a few questions. Could we maybe discuss this? And your board chair will say, yeah, we'll set aside 10 minutes and we'll get a financial review. Your question may get answered in the financial review, but it may not. And if then, the best thing you can do, claim your voice, claim your perspective, claim your expertise, and ask that question. Because not only is it how you're building your own experience to become an even better board member later on, you're also kind of required to do that through that duty of care thing we talked about earlier. It's not uncommon for an insurance carrier who insures an organization to not honor a D&O policy, because they'll say this fiscal malfeasance went on for years and no one asked a single question. No, we're not going to step up. You didn't perform your duty of care by gathering information. So never hesitate to ask questions, because not only are you going to be able to gather more information for yourself, expand your own experience and become a better board member, you're actually legally required to make the decisions in the best interest of the organization. And the only way you can do that is if you have plenty of information moving forward. So when people say, how can I be the most effective board member? I tell people, be who you are and feel comfortable asking questions through who you are, because that's going to bring a perspective no one else has, I promise. So the last couple of slides we have, the first is 5 core questions that you should be asking yourself as a board member. And then I reached out to Kim Leverage, who is supposed to teach this. And I mentioned earlier, Kim's PhD is in industrial and organizational psychology. I said, what are a few other challenges they may face? And that's what we're going to talk about these 2 closing slides. First and foremost, the question you should be asking yourself, number 1, is, what is your source of credibility and how do you establish it? How do you help establish your voice? How do you know, let people know what you bring to the table? The biggest way you can do that is, see our previous slide, claiming your voice, letting people know what your expertise is. I've said before, sometimes the biggest critic we have, or we sell ourselves short far more than other people would. That's a hurdle successful board members have to get over, because they understand they're bringing a perspective. I have no problem prefacing a lot of questions I ask with, stop me from being stupid, but I realize this may seem commonsensical to other people, but I want to make sure I'm giving the best decision I can, and I need some more information. So first and foremost, let them know where you're coming from and let them know what you bring to the table. Secondly, make sure you're building an evidence-based, value-driven argument. We don't have time in board service. You're addressing real problems. Now's not the time for ad hominem arguments or personal agendas or chips on your shoulder. Hey, is this the best interest? Or I have a thought on this and this is why I have it. Is it value-driven? Is it evidence-based? Here in, I will tell you, here in Tulsa, in general, and Northeast Oklahoma in the whole, our organizations do an amazing job of being data-driven. They're not driven by emotion. They bring in as much information as they can and they move forward doing that. And I think that's one of the reasons we have such a successful nonprofit sector here in the city. But you need to ask yourself, as a board member, with your thoughts on how to move things forward, is it evidence-based and value-driven? And if so, how do I establish that? Number 3, the biggest difference between being right and being effective. You approach board service, I tell people, in the same way you approach personal relationships or professional relationships. Sometimes we all have to be right. It's part of being human. But the greater good comes from being effective. Sometimes we do need to be right. I feel very strongly about some of the decisions we're going to make. But I also understand that if the vote is 10-5 and I'm in the 5, I need to respect the majority of the 10. And I need to be able to know that being effective is more important than being right, because being right is about my own personal opinion. Being effective is about my responsibility as a board member moving forward. So don't confuse the two. I know a lot of people, I started my entertainment career in stand-up comedy. Before the first comedy shows I ever promoted after I toured as a stand-up comedian were comedy shows. And when folks would come to me and say, I want to be a stand-up comedian, I'd say, do you want to be funny or do you want to be popular? Because there's two drastically different situations there, and most people tend to confuse the two. The same tends to happen. Am I right or am I effective? My own ego is checked at the door. I'm coming in objectively with my value-driven and evidence-based thoughts, and I'm going to be effective, not right. What is the bigger picture and how do your ideas fit into it? When someone asks me to be on a board, my question is, another question I ask, I should say, in our conversation, hey, what are your 3 stories? And 2 minutes or less, tell me your past, tell me your present, and tell me where you're looking to go. Because if I can't help you get there, I don't want to waste a board seat for you or my own time. So make sure you understand what the bigger picture is and how you can help them get there. I get a lot of requests to help people put on benefit shows. Johnny did concerts. He must know all about it. If Garth Brooks were only aware of the good we did, he'd want to donate his time and make $1 million. And I tell people, I have no problem even putting in your request to Emmett, who's Garth's assistant, but you need to understand you're still going to need to spend $750,000 to $1 million just to be able to raise that. And that's when they say, oh, well, would you help us do that? And I say, no, I can't. That's not what I do. What I do is best practice. I can't make that decision. I don't fit into your big picture overall. Sometimes I do. But be aware, this is what my skill set is. This is why I'm joining a board. This is their long-term vision. Do they all 3 fit? Or is there going to be a little friction between the two? And sometimes there's nothing wrong with saying no to board service. Sometimes the best decision you can make for yourself and for the organization is to say, no, thank you. It's not where my heart lies. I don't have enough time. I'm not sure I fully understand your mission. There's nothing wrong with saying that. And then lastly, do you understand your own knowledge and experience in terms of its values to others? That kind of sums up the first 4 questions. If you don't understand your own experience, ask yourself a few tough questions. Because I can tell you the value everyone on this call will bring to a board meeting, just because that's what I've been doing for so long. But you need to understand your own value as well. So understand what your experiences are, understand how they can be beneficial, and bring that to your board service. Most of the time, people leave it lying in the background, and I say, well, in fact, I literally had someone the other day call and say, we're looking for someone to help us develop a marketing campaign, and we want strong visuals. And I said, were you aware that this person on your board has been a producer of several Hollywood movies that you've heard of before they moved back to Tulsa? And that was kind of where their passion, and they had no idea. Now, part of that is on the board side because they weren't getting to know their board members and their experience and what they're bringing to the table. But part of it was on the individual member's side as well, because he hadn't said, this is how I might be able to help. So know what your knowledge is, know what your experience is, and feel free to bring them back. I asked Kim, I said, hey, what are some things that some hurdles they may face that I haven't covered so far, because I do want to leave some time for Q&A. And Kim gave me a few great examples. First and foremost, you have to understand people bring complexity. I always refer to the line from Men in Black, the movie with Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. When Will Smith says, why don't you just tell people aliens exist? People are smart. And Tommy Lee Jones says, no, a person is smart. People are stupid. And there's a big difference between the two. We're stupid because we're complex and we all have unique opinions and we all have our own perspectives, and we're putting them into this massive pot, mixing up, and we just assume everyone is going to see our point of view. They won't. I'll tell you right now, before your first board service opportunity, they won't. So understand people are complex. And sometimes what it's about isn't what it is about at all, because we are so complex as we move forward. And those complexities can come from, gender, backgrounds, education, values, socioeconomic, geographic upbringings, religious affiliation, gender identity, sexual orientation, anything, political ideologies, anything you want to have come into play. Keep in mind, as I said earlier, there's 7.whatever billion different ones, all interswirling with each other at any given time. So the basic guideline I tell people, I say, show some grace. Wendy's been a great board member for 2 years, and then she suddenly stopped showing up. Now she's a bad board member. No, maybe there's an external force. I had this, and this is just a common story that I see it threaded through my job. Someone will call me and they'll say, hey, this board person was great, but all of a sudden they started underperforming. And then the last example, I knew the board member personally and professionally, and I had been given that permission to share. And I said, were you aware that her husband was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and that each night she has to go home to take care of him, and her attention may be elsewhere? The board had no idea. And I said, just always have the default assumption if underperformance is an issue, there may be external factors at play that we're not aware of. And even if you are aware of them, then be as graceful as you can be, because back up here, people bring complexity. We're complex beings, and that's how we are.
Can I say something about that, Johnny, too?
Please.
You
Yes.
get into a situation where something changes in your life and you realize you're not going to be able to fulfill the commitments you've made, it's actually very appropriate to reach out and say, I'm going to have to drop off the board, even if you haven't filled out your entire term on that board of directors, so that you can make a space for someone who maybe can. And that actually preserves your professional reputation in a way. Sometimes you can take a temporary leave of absence and they'll let you do that. Sometimes resigning is the right thing, but that preserves your opportunity to go back on that board when things change again, versus continuing to try and juggle more than you can, and not doing a good job and hurting that professional reputation.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Yes, I always tell people, over communicate, specifically to the level of information in the context that you feel comfortable with, but it's never going to hurt your reputation to be honest and upfront and say, hey, I've had some life changes. I need to focus on this. I need to roll off before my term's done, or maybe we can have a discussion in a year or two, whatever it may be. It will only help your reputation, I promise you. I asked Kim, I said, hey, we're talking about the gender differences. I'm speaking as a white, straight, middle-aged, landowning male. I have benefits built in and privileges built in I'm not even aware of. Could we talk a little bit about the gender differences? Or Kim, would you shine some light on this? And she said it's kind of a grace versus grit approach. Men are expected to have one leadership style and women are expected to have another. And you either accept those as predeterminations of what should be, or you swing to the opposite. You say everybody's equal, nobody has their unique backgrounds, it shouldn't matter one way or the other. Yes, they do matter. Our experiences, our life enhancement journeys, our life expectations are all completely unique. So understand, sometimes men and women, for example, will manage differently. So will other people. Women and women will manage differently. Men and men will manage differently. But understand, sometimes there tends to be, especially in Oklahoma, where our boards are what I call the three ales, pale, male, and stale. That's how they tend to be comprised. There tends to be that approach of grace versus grit. Either they're going to be tough and aggressive, or they're going to be laid back and accepting. And it doesn't have to be that way. But you do want to know what your own management style is. And if you aren't sure of it, feel free to go back to some mentors, some former colleagues of yours, and say, hey, how would you describe my management style? If you talk to 10 people and 9 of them say similar things, there's probably some accuracy there, and you would want to be aware of that. The workplace culture of the organization will be a part of the board service that you serve on. I will tell people, speaking from my very real experience, sometimes you're not aware you're in a hostile or a toxic culture until you get out of it. And then looking back, you're like, holy cow, how could I have done that? It's no different than relationships that we've been in. There's a point in time in a relationship where you think this person could be the one. And you look back and you think, wow, how could I have been even remotely interested in that person? We're so dissimilar across the board. So understand the workplace culture is part of the board, and the board culture is part of the workplace. You can help enhance that and elevate it and bring it to a level that develops itself, or you can be aware that, hey, something isn't right and I'm not going to do anything about it. Now, I'm not saying you need to have an in-depth cultural assessment before you accept board service, but don't hesitate to ask around and realize if there's, I tell people as the perfect example, if a nonprofit organization has had 6 different executive directors over the last 4 years, there may be a deeper cultural issue at place. And you need to be aware of those things. And then lastly, the concept of stress as we approach things. Anytime, if you're a human being, if you have a heartbeat and you're listening to this right now, you have emotional triggers. We all do. And when those triggers occur, usually through no fault of the other person, although sometimes the triggering party is aware and trying to trigger, when those triggers happen, we become emotionally flooded, we become stressed, upset, depressed, whatever it may be. And when you're in an emotionally flooded state, you can't make a rational decision any better than an intoxicated person could drive a car. So understand that, hey, coming with board service, solving these very big issues in very big, meaningful ways are going to come sometimes with some stressful situations, especially in a global pandemic. I promise the stress level of every nonprofit organization in the sector between January and May was probably exponential in how it increased. And just be aware that, hey, this is a stressful situation. It's triggering me in different ways I may not have been aware of. That's going to affect my objectivity. And hopefully you'll be able to handle that moving forward. And even if you find yourself being triggered and experiencing these good emotions or bad emotions, or wanting to lean one way or wanting to lean the other, don't hesitate to reach out to us or Wendy, because we've got wonderful ways of coping and whatnot. The last slide, the next to last slide, the last slide actually is just a contact information. But the last slide, I want you to ask yourselves, and then we'll open it up for questions. Hey, why do you want to be a board member? And even more importantly, why do you want to be a good one? What is it going to take for you, the person right there, to be a good board member? Are you going to be accountable? And are you going to hold yourself and allow the board to hold you accountable? Are you going to be flexible? That's part of that 10 to 5, 8 to 7 vote scenario we talked about earlier. Are you going to be present? Hey, am I going to be here not just physically, but as well as spiritually and emotionally? Am I going to be tied in mentally? Am I going to be here to participate, or am I just going to be here to show up? Are you going to be honest? I am astounded how many times board members are dishonest for all the wrong reasons. Not that there's ever a right one, but for ones that we would laugh at. As Wendy talked about earlier, if you see a life change, if you have a thought on the decision, if you have an idea to move forward, always be honest and speak up about it, because it will only help out. Are you going to be communicative? Are you going to be responsible? Are you going to be effective? If you can't look at this list and say, yes, I want to be all these things, then you may not be the most effective or the most efficient board member out there. But if you're taking some of the things that we've talked about over the last hour and you're able to answer, yes, I want to be these things in my board service, then I promise you'll be a very effective board member. You'll be a very effective committee member. That's, board or committee members don't need to be on a board, so you can still be of service to an organization while kind of testing the waters to see if you'd even want to be a board member. If you can answer yes to these things, you'll be a very effective board member, and you'll be a long-term success for any organization you serve. I'm only going to flash this the contact information up here briefly. Wendy has my direct line, my email, our address, any type of information you may need to get if you want to reach out with me. Please don't hesitate to reach out to her and give it to you. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I always tell people that, so when the face is rearranged, they're not too surprised. And I'd love to hear if there are any questions through you, Wendy, or any thoughts that Wendy may have before we wind up wrapping for today.
Yeah, there was one good question early on. Someone remarked that your training is normally 5 hours and we were doing it in 1 hour. Of course, these people are more brilliant than most people, so we're fast studies. Yes. But Michelle asked if there's any reading you would recommend. I noticed Board Source was one of the sources on your slides. So what does Center for Nonprofits suggest for board members to maybe further their education reading wise?
Board Source is a wonderful way to start. My approach to reading is always pretty in-depth. This is what I'm going through this month, because I normally
turn them around the other way.
I read. Oh, well, I'm not going to necessarily.
Oh, okay.
I read about 220 books a year. I don't have TV. I don't watch movies. That's what I do. But Board Source is a great way to start. The Standards for Excellence Institute, they also have a lot of wonderful information, and the National Council for Nonprofits. All three of their websites have short articles that are like 3 or 4 minute reads, the long reads that you could spend an evening on, and book recommendations that are updated daily. The reason I really like National Council for Nonprofits and Board Source, they don't tend to be as COVID focused. There are some COVID related research issues and articles, but if you could look at National Council for Nonprofits, Board Source, and then the Standards for Excellence Institute, they can give a great list. For the organizations here in Tulsa, I will send Wendy a list, because we do have a reading recommendation. I just don't have it pulled up. I'll send it to her. She can forward it out to you, and it'll give you some good places to start. That's a great
I love that idea. Another book that I recommend, Jim Collins has Good to Great for the social sector. It's a tiny little monograph. I think it's still in print. I think reading widely, Harvard Business Review, all sorts of things that are about how do you run good businesses actually have a lot of application. How do you run good nonprofits, right? Because nonprofits at their essence are businesses. They just have a social sector purpose as opposed to a for-profit purpose.
And that well-balanced approach really does take, I'm reading, I'm on a bit of a holistic kick right now. I'm reading two books that I've been recommending highly for board service members. One is called Breathe, simply, and the other is called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's a great way on how you can not only know your own skill set, but how you can manage that towards serving external organizations or people or relationships or collaborations. And that's another great one. But I know it was still in print a couple years ago, Wendy. I haven't tried to find it since then, but it certainly was. And Collins is always somebody that you want to keep up with.
Another thought I have, when you're talking about knowing your own skill sets, I just want to really underscore that, because one of the challenges when you join a board is often people have very little information about you. They have your name, maybe your title and where you work. And a good executive director, a good board president will probe that a little bit and find out a little bit more about your talents, your skills, your interests, your gifts. But often it's helpful because sometimes you have things in your background that aren't immediately obvious from looking at your resume, or maybe you have some things in that you'd like to build up. So nonprofit service is a great opportunity to build some new skills. So one of my favorite stories is I had a board member, eventually a board president, and he worked at the Tulsa World. And so when he and I had his first sort of introductory conversation as he was coming on our board, he goes, so I know you're going to want my help on the PR committee. I will definitely help you with your public relations, but what I'd really like to do is be involved in the programs committee, and I'd like to work on my public speaking abilities. And so knowing that, I was able to help him better navigate his board experience. So sometimes you're sitting there, you're wondering, well, why hasn't anyone asked me to help with this? It's because they don't even know that that's an area of interest or gift that you have. So I think it's really important to lean in when the moment is right. Raise your hand and say, I'll be involved in that. I'll do that. I'll serve on that committee. I'll chair that committee. That's the other thing I always like to say. The best board members actually begin to imagine themselves in leadership roles. So it's not just serving on the board for 6, 8, 12 years and approving the minutes once a month. It's like, am I a future treasurer? Do I see myself chairing the fundraising event? Could I be the secretary of the board? I've been secretary of a lot of boards because taking notes is easy for me. And so that's a place I can give. So, and thinking of yourself as a future president, it happens.
Exactly right. And I know they say there's close to 1 million people in the greater Tulsa area, and I know it feels like there's really only 319 and we all know each other. Don't rely on other people. I know it's the joy of Tulsa is whenever I go out and I'm consulting, it's somebody that I went to Bishop Kelly with, or somebody that I knew through this situation, or somebody that I knew through that situation. But don't rely on other people. And it is tough to kind of toot our own horn, but let people know, hey, this is what I bring. In the same line, you can say, hey, you know what? I'm not particularly interested in helping in this way. It's not uncommon when you say, hey, we need some legal advice on the board, for an attorney to say, I'd love to weigh in, but I'm going to recuse myself if there's any representation. It's not uncommon, and there's nothing wrong with saying, I'd love to participate in this way, but this other thing isn't my particular jam, and I probably wouldn't be able to be as engaged or feel as connected that way. So just let people know, as Wendy said, let them know what you're bringing, and let them know what you want to do and what you don't, because that's how you're going to be a great board member.
And if you do get involved and say yes, maybe the person you admire and have a hard time saying no to asked you to do something and you realize it's a bad match and you're either not going to do it or you're not going to do a good job, please tell someone. One of my favorite memories of running a nonprofit was way back when I ran the Arts and Humanities Council. And I had a couple of male co-chairs of a committee to do a big event. And they had someone who was in charge of soliciting sponsorships as a volunteer, and it wasn't getting done. And they got that poor guy on a conference call and said, "Are you going to do this?" And he goes, "Oh, yeah, I'll do it." And then it was like 24 hours later, he slept on it and he realized, this is not what I want to do. I'm not going to get this done. And it was a gift to know that, even though it was hard for him to admit it, because then we could go and find somebody else to do the job. So I think
Exactly.
Being honest about your plate, your capacity, your skill sets is important. Mercedes put a resource in the chat thread, The Art of Asking, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Let People Help. That sounds like great self-help book in a lot of areas. And I don't know what your next.
I think that's Amanda Palmer. I actually have read that, and that is a good one. If that's the one that I'm thinking of.
She's a performance artist, so that not safe for work. There's some outside conversations in the book.
Yeah.
Actually, I think I have read that. Did she date the science fiction author Neil Gaiman? Yes, I read that. It was awesome. Okay, well, we are at the end of our time. Johnny, thank you so much for being with us on short notice as Kim is dealing with her power outage. We're delighted for our partnership with Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits. If this group of people was going to take one class that Oklahoma Center for Nonprofits offers, which class would you recommend?
I would. I'd recommend. I'm going to take the easy way out and recommend one of two. Either Standards for Excellence, which is it's an overview of 75 best practices that all nonprofits should do. Standards is the National Ethics and Accountability Code for nonprofits. So either that one or our boot camp for boards, where we can take a much deeper dive into a lot of the things we've talked about today. Both of those are pretty popular and ones that we love teaching.
Good. Well, thank you everyone so much for being here. I will send out the slides along with the recording tomorrow or the next day, and everyone have a great night.
Thanks so much. Have a great one.